listen. Frustrated by his failure to get his party's message across at Westminster, he set out on a 3-week tour of the UK. On his only visit to Wales, he came to Barry Comprehensive, a school that's turned itself around. Even though the Conservatives are critics of the comprehensive system, IDS, as he's called, says he's keen to learn from the good practice at the school.
One of the reasons I'm coming here is because this school has, over the last 4 or 5 years, begun to really show some excellent improvement. And I was here talking to some of your teachers earlier on, trying to find out why in this school you were being able to make improvements.
As part of his new softer image, the Conservative leader is keen to be seen as sympathetic to the kind of problems faced by these young people in Barry. And with Assembly elections in May, he hopes that these first-time voters in a key Conservative target seat will do some listening of their own. Lee Waters, HTV News.
The recent A-level fiasco. The Tory leader has been criticised by the government for saying that people didn't know whether A-levels were worth the paper they were written on. So what did Welsh pupils make of this pretty bold statement? Our political editor David Williams asked Mr Duncan Smith if his comments undermined pupils.
What is essentially the real problem here is that the government themselves has been undermining the value of those A-levels by creating confusion and chaos, particularly this year, but also before, in the way that they've been implementing the whole sixth form process that leads to that A-level achievement. Doesn't undervalue, well, let me finish, doesn't undervalue students who have worked hard, who've striven to get their exams and who've got their exams. Remember, it's not the opposition that has any power to undermine anything. The government themselves have created chaos this year. You've had exams being remarked and students who have actually worked hard. So who is, well, let's just deal with the reality, though. Those pupils who have worked hard have had to sit now for weeks wondering whether or not their A grades were worth anything because they might have to be changed.
Do you think that the AS is worth the paper it's written on?
Every student I've talked to, every teacher I've talked to, and every parent says that this puts far too much pressure on children in the first year of their studies.
You do away with them?
Yeah, well, we've recommended the government should now look to do away with AS levels, to let the students go right through to their A's, and thus not have that pressure halfway through, but really focus on their A levels. And most pupils that I talk to here today and in other areas all say they wish that that was the case.
Can we just look at another area? The Welsh Tories launching their manifesto this week said that parents should have greater freedom in choosing which school they send their children to. What happens in a school like this if everybody decides to send their children here? How do you deal with oversubscription?
The limits that are set on schools are often artificial. If schools can expand to fit demand, then we believe very strongly that we should look at ways of actually allowing that to happen. In other words, we want all children to find good schooling and to get an opportunity. At the moment, the government says the system must come first and the children come second. My answer is no. It's the system that serves the children. Let's put the children first.
That man of politics joins us now. Good evening. Welcome to Dragon's Eye.
Thanks. Nice
to be here. Had a good day in Wales?
It's been fantastic. I've learnt things. I've just visited a school that I think I learnt more in 2 hours visiting that school than possibly I've learnt in a couple of years sitting around in Westminster.
This was Barry Comprehensive School?
Absolutely, yeah. And the head teacher, who is just exactly what you need in a school to get it moving.
Well, when we're talking about education then, let's look at one of those policies we mentioned there, freedom for parents to choose a school for their children. Yeah. Does that mean that you then abandon failing schools in the process?
No, I think what this reflects is that there's a real concern. We published a pamphlet about a month or so ago which showed that schools in England and Wales are beginning to separate. You've got inner-city schools failing worse and worse.
Not many of those in Wales, though.
Well, you say that, but the real problem here is, and this is where we get to the problem, it's that the teachers and head teachers do not have the power any longer to really run their schools in the way that they need to. They've got local authorities looking over their shoulders, they've got government with targets and directives, you've got appeals panels stopping them get rid of very, very difficult and disruptive pupils, causing huge mayhem in some of the schools. And my point is, what we're trying to get across is that we want to trust teachers, head teachers, governors to run their schools and say, actually, we're going to get the politicians out of them.
I understand what you're saying, and it sounds so appealing, and I'm sure a lot of parents would welcome that. But the point I was making is, what happens to those children left behind in those schools from where parents have taken them to and sent them to the schools of their choice? Do they then rot, as it were?
No, far from it. What you have is a twofold process. The first is in giving parents the right to choose to go out of the system if necessary, to actually choose to go to good schools. What you then have is an almost immediate focus on failure. It forces immediately, government, local government, to actually deal with failing schools. So in other words, if a school is failing, then even in my constituency, actually, in London, we had schools that had been failing for years in there and were in special measures, and the local authority didn't care less because their policy was sink schooling.
Right.
So they can't do that any longer.
Right, so you identify
right.
those two areas, money, cost.
Yeah.
How do you build up that failing school, and how do you fund the school where every parent wants to send their children?
Well, because if actually what's happening is we're finding a new school that's actually going to succeed, then in essence that grows and those people go to that school.
But increase taxes to pay for all this?
Well, at the moment you've got increased taxes.
Yes, but would you increase taxes in order
my
to fund
point is that
this
the money
very
that
attractive
the money
policy?
they're already taxing us. I mean, we have a ramp of taxes coming in our direction with national insurance increases. The government is already now spending more money on both health and education, and yet, as was said earlier on, waiting lists are getting longer in health, and failing schools
But isn't
are
the
failing.
problem greater, more acute in places like Wales? I know you hate this argument, you know, yes, rural Wales and so on. But there is...
I don't hate it, I just don't think it's
you don't
relevant.
like it, you don't like it, but would you accept that there is a level of poverty and deprivation in Wales that has to be addressed, and a lot of money has to be poured to getting it right? That's why there's a problem in Wales.
Well, there's a problem in Wales, but there's a problem also in places like Manchester, there's a problem in places like Birmingham and London, in Bradford. You're not alone.
Well,
my
a lot of people say as a direct consequence of 18 years of Conservative rule.
My view is things have got worse in the last 5 years, but I'm not going to refight the '97 election. I have to live in the world I am right now, which is there are serious problems right now. And one of the things I did when I first took over as leader is I sent my colleagues to countries like Holland, France,
You've built up a lot of air miles.
Well, they have, but for good purpose. Because what we saw over there was that nobody else does education or health like we do. They are astounded when we tell them that we don't entertain the idea of choice in quite the same way as they do. The Dutch say, but you have a statutory right to choose your schools.
Yes, but given that we have the system that we have, do you accept...
Well, change it.
OK, all right, but if we change it, do we change it and establish a two-tier health system?
You have a two-tier health system right now.
Yes, but you want to use public money to give treatment in the private sector.
You've asked me if we want a two-tier health system. I've said we've got one. Last year, in England and Wales, over 250,000 people had to leave the health service to fund their own treatment outside in the private sector. Why? Because the waiting list was too long and they were in pain. Do you know, over 50% of them were pensioners. They had to sell something, they had to join their family.
So you would pay for that treatment, is
what
we're
we're saying is, in places like France, in places like Finland,
yes, but
they say...
in Wales.
No, I'm saying what we've learned from them is that they don't say, well, hard luck to you. They say, we'll help you. And I think that's what we've got to do.
Right.
We've got to say, if you have to go out, if we can't meet certain waiting times, if we can't deliver treatment to you, we have an obligation
Again,
to help
very
you get
attractive.
treatment.
Nobody, especially those on waiting lists, would argue with that. What I'm asking you is that if you were to do that, we've heard Mr. Bourne say there, that you would identify savings in order to pay for it. If you can do all this, why not put it into the National Health Service and improve that?
Well, because there are 2 points to make about that. First of all, you're doing more than just talking about savings. What you're actually talking about is the willingness of people to spend extra money on healthcare because it's going directly to them. What we're saying is, if we were able to manage that correctly, if we were able to assist them, two things would happen. One, more people who can't afford the full cost would be prepared to say, well, I can afford some of that. And so you would help the waiting list by more people moving out and broadening healthcare. And the point we learned from that, this is quite important, because I answer your second question, is that actually in places like France, they do just that and they don't have waiting lists. Now, the other question, which is...
I'll ask you to be brief at this point.
All right. The other question, which is about savings, is very simply this. It's not just about saying only tax money works. This is the problem. Only in this country do we say taxes only, state system run by us. Everybody else is broader.
Iain Duncan Smith, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.